course, there are some newer questions that face society today. There are also that can also benefit from us understanding why there is this variation in family systems. So you may have seen this particular piece of news. This relates to a court case that concluded late last year, where the Canadian High Court was called to judge as to whether the anti-polygamy law in a Canadian constitution should be banned. And he ruled that it should not, for a variety of reasons. And so understanding where norms for monogamy, for example, come from can also help us address some societal challenges. Another one that comes up in the media regularly, at least in the UK, has to do with whether we should forbid cousin marriage in the UK. And this is because in the UK there is a large Pakistani community, and in this particular community cousin marriage is the preferred form. So we have very high rates of cousin marriage. So where does cousin marriage come from? Why do these societies have this practice at such high rates? These are questions that we should be interested in beyond the sort of academic domain. Okay, so I will be focusing in particular on monogamous marriage, relating to some work that I've been doing over the last few years. And so this is what I'll be talking about. So I'll give you some definitions of marriage practices, then I'll talk briefly about the cross-cultural distribution of these norms, and then I'll give you a little bit of history. The purpose of this part of the talk is to give you a sense of how questions about marriage strategies are addressed in evolutionary anthropology. And then I'll talk about some of my own work relating to monogamous marriage, starting with a theoretical analysis and then some tests of predictions of the model. Okay, so this is how we define marriage strategies in anthropology. We have monogamous marriage, which is the marriage of one husband and one wife. We have polygynous marriage, the marriage of one husband to multiple wives, and polyandrous marriage, the marriage of multiple husbands to one wife. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I want to point out a couple of things. First, that when I'm talking about monogamous marriage, I'm really talking about a marriage arrangement. I'm not talking about pair bonding. As far as we can tell, we find pair bonding in societies irrespective of their marriage norms. And I'm not talking about monogamous mating. I'm not talking about sexual monogamy. As far as we can tell, we don't see strict sexual monogamy in very many human societies, irrespective of the marriage norm. And also just to point out that for example, in the press we see polygamy used to mean polygyny, but in fact polygamy really means any form of non-monogamy. So I'll try and be specific in my usage of these terms. Now, if we look at the distribution of these norms across human societies, we see something that many people find surprising, and that is that the vast majority of societies allow some form of polygynous marriage. Polyandrous marriage is allowed only in a very small fraction of societies, and monogamy is enforced in roughly 17% of societies. These are data from the standard cross-cultural sample, Murdoch and White, that you may be familiar with. This is a sample of 196 societies that was put together to be roughly representative of variation in human cultural practices. Each dot in the map is one society. These are small-scale societies, typically described at contact, so what we call the ethnographic present. So this is not the modern US, clearly this is traditional societies.
Just to clarify, are you considering serial monogamy as a type of monogamy?
This particular sample does not, I think it's just looking at the norm, so it's not considering serial polygyny or serial polyandry. It's not included in this particular sample. This is just saying, is there a norm that allows men to be married simultaneously?
Okay.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we don't have that level of detail here. Let me just point out in this particular sample, there are two societies that are polyandrous: the Todas in South England and the Marquesans in the Pacific. So polyandry is extremely rare. So a small fraction of societies enforce monogamous marriage. Now, in evolutionary anthropology, broadly defined, the way we tend to explain that particular distribution is through recourse to what some people call Bateman's principle. And Angus Bateman was a geneticist, a Scottish geneticist, who published a paper in 1948 when he was looking at the relationship between number of offspring as a function of number of mates. And he found something that is relatively intuitive. For males, the number of offspring increases with number of mates, for females, not really. And this is obviously because in sexually reproducing species, the sex that we define as female tends to be the sex that invests more in gametes. And so there tend to be some physical constraints on number of offspring. So in mammals, this is especially true because, of course, we have internal gestation in mammals and an extended period of postnatal care through lactation that tie females to the offspring, which is obviously not true of males. And so this principle is used to explain why the vast majority of mammalian species have a pattern of polygynous breeding where males mate with multiple females. And it's also used to explain why the vast majority of human societies allow polygynous marriage. There are greater payoffs to males from being polygynous, and so this would be captured by a system of a norm of polygynous marriage. This is a sound of explanation. There are some implications of this. And this is that polygynous marriage is always the best strategy for men. This is pervasive in evolutionary anthropology accounts of marriage strategies. And so other forms of marriage is viewed as puzzling, right? There's something strange going on if we don't have polygynous marriage. And what is interesting to me is that in most of these accounts, there are of course some exceptions, women are viewed as passive players, right? The marriage strategy captures what benefits men, and women, you know, Darwin said they should be coy and just, there's not a lot of sort of female choice in standard accounts at least, and so women are assigned this passive role. And I have here a paper where Rob is also a co-author, of course, and just to sort of give you a sense of the sort of puzzle of monogamous marriage, this comes up very often. The standard idea is that we should see polygyny. Now, there are many ways that one could approach this, and I tend to approach this from this particular framework from perspective of history. Now, if we look at marriage norms through history, we see something interesting. So it's true that cross-culturally, polygynous marriage is very prevalent, as I've shown you on the map. But when we look at norms over time, we see that restrictions on polygynous marriage are in fact very early. So this is the Code of Hammurabi. This is the earliest legal document that we have, some 4,000 years old. And the code says what people should do in Babylonia. And with respect to marriage, it says that men should marry only one wife. There were some special cases, circumstances, when they were allowed a second wife. And they were allowed a second wife if the first wife was ill or infertile, so she wasn't able to produce children. Or they were allowed a second wife if they had consent from the first wife. Now, of course, we don't know how actual behavior relates to what is in the code, but this idea that men don't just marry as many wives as they like is actually very early on in the historical record. And also, females do play some role, at least in the legal codes. It's unclear whether they did in actual life. But so this is something that is interesting to me. Now, as I said, we don't really know how actual behavior related to the code, but there are other cases in history that are much better documented, and these are the case of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, in ancient Rome, for example, we know that marriage was strictly monogamous between two individuals. In fact, if a man married an additional wife, then the first marriage was annulled. So in that sense, marriage was strictly monogamous. But what is interesting about the Roman case, to me, is that we know that polygynous mating was common and socially condoned. So we have a lot of accounts of wealthy Roman men having sexual access and fathering children with very large numbers of female slaves, for example. So to me, if there is a puzzle of monogamous marriage, is why some societies enforce monogamous marriage when in fact they allow polygynous mating in this case. Of course, if there is polygynous mating, there's going to be some polyandrous mating too. So this to me is the puzzle of monogamous marriage. Why you see a norm that enforces one thing when actual behavior is allowed to differ. So with collaborator Marco Archetti, who's an evolutionary biologist currently at the University of Basel in Switzerland, we asked whether we can understand marriage strategies as the outcome of the strategic allocation of resources to future generations. The reason we're interested in resources and wealth is that, at least in traditional societies, wealth is a correlate to reproductive success. And so the idea behind this work is that marriage strategies in general may have more to do with the transfer of property across generations than they have to do with mating and the production of children. And that's why we should think about mating and marriage separately. So really when we're talking about monogamous marriage, we're talking about what I call monogamous inheritance. We're talking about ways of restricting the number of heirs. So we have developed two relatively intuitive principles for why monogamous marriage may make sense in these terms. And this is what I call the principle of depletion through division and the principle of higher paternity for exclusive investment. So let me start with the first one. So this relates to the question of how many heirs. So I illustrate this with this diagram. In this case, we have a man, his wife, and the wife's offspring. And the man's resources will go to the wife's offspring. There is only one wife because marriage is monogamous. And if you think about a polygynous family, you have a man, the man has multiple wives, there are multiple sets of wives' offspring, and so the man's resources will be divided among these offspring. So already this simple case illustrates how in a polygynous setting you typically have some division of resources among multiple heirs. Now of course women have multiple children and human societies have norms of unigeniture that limit the number of heirs when there are multiple children. So in the case of primogeniture, for example, the firstborn son of the wife inherits. If you have monogamous marriage with primogeniture, then you have one firstborn son, right? If you have polygynous marriage with primogeniture, you have as many firstborn sons as you have wives. And so each one of these sons will inherit a share to the father's estate. This is an idea that those of you working in or familiar with the East African literature will be familiar with this idea of the household property complex, that it's really sort of the wife is a household, each wife is a separate household. So this suggested to us and to many anthropologists before us that monogamous marriage may be, monogamous marriage allows for resources to be concentrated in a single heir, possibly with recourse to norms of unigeniture, whereas polygynous marriage involves some degree of division of resources among multiple heirs. And so the idea is that monogamous marriage may be advantageous where the value of resources is depleted through division among multiple heirs, whereas polygynous marriage may be advantageous where the value of resources is not depleted through division among multiple heirs. And we'll get back to this distinction later on. So this is this idea of depletion through division and how different marriage strategies impact how resources are distributed among heirs. Now the second principle is this idea of higher paternity for exclusive investment. And this relates to the pathway that resources take from one generation to the next. So far I've talked about resources going from a man to the wife's offspring. But there are some, this is what we call patrilineal inheritance, right? There are some societies where resources are transferred from a man to his sister's offspring instead, and to the wife's offspring. This is matrilineal inheritance. It's found in approximately 10% of human societies. The reason I bring this up is just to say that men have options when it comes to transferring resources to related individuals in future generations. And we have a very nice, interesting model in behavioral ecology, what we call the paternity threshold model, that tries to determine when males should invest in sisters' offspring as opposed to wives' offspring. This is a very simple model. What it does, it computes the coefficient of relatedness as a function of the probability of paternity. This is the coefficient of relatedness between a man and his wife's offspring and a man and his sister's offspring. And when you compare these two, what you see is that a man is more closely related to his wife's offspring for most values of the probability of paternity. There is a threshold value of P below which a man is more closely related to his sister's offspring than to his wife's offspring. And so the model predicts that below this threshold value, a man should invest in sister's offspring. Above the threshold value, a man should invest in wife's offspring. Now, there are many issues with this particular model. One being, of course, that this level of paternity is unrealistically low for most human societies. But there is some sort of, at least anecdotal, in fact, cross-cultural intuition that matrilineal societies are societies where levels of paternity tend to be lower than patrilineal societies. Again, this is a very simple model, very early days in behavioral ecology, but it has produced a lot of work, and it's an interesting idea. The reason I bring this up here is just to, again, as I said, bring across the point that men have options in investing resources to future generations, and that we can actually build on this for our own work. So the idea behind this model is that males invest or allocate investment strategically based on the level of paternity. We extended this reasoning to argue that if males invest resources strategically based on the level of paternity, then females may invest paternity, may allocate paternity strategically based on the level of male investment. And what you may see is a situation where both males and females benefit from monogamous marriage. Males will benefit from monogamous marriage because they would invest resources in the wife's offspring, knowing that the wife's offspring are in fact their own offspring. So they're investing resources safely in the next generation, if you like. And females benefit from having exclusive investment of the husband's resources in their own offspring. So we extended the reasoning from the paternity threshold model to include strategic female behavior as well as strategic male behavior. And so this is this idea that there is a trade-off between paternity on the one hand and investment of resources on the other. So this is a sort of intuitive description of this, and we put all of this in a game-theoretic model that will tell us which combinations of male and female strategies are stable. And these are the evolutionarily stable strategies, and the sort of conditions leading to stability of monogamous marriage will give us some intuition of what is driving the evolution of these strategies. So I'll quickly talk you through the conditions that drive the stability of monogamous marriage. And one is that we only see monogamy when males transfer resources vertically, meaning to their wives' offspring as opposed to their sisters' offspring. So this is the case that I illustrated earlier. You should see monogamy in this particular case when there is transfer of resources to wives' offspring. You should not see monogamous marriage with transfer of resources to the young offspring. And I'll show you a test of this with cross-cultural data later. This to me is interesting because although it's a pattern that comes out of the cross-cultural data, there is really very little work in anthropology focusing on this particular relationship. The second condition that drives the stability of monogamous marriage is that multiple heirs are costly. So multiple heirs are costly when we have this depletion through division in the value of resources when the resources are divided among multiple heirs. And this is not surprising because it's something that we built into the model. But what is interesting to us, and something that the model taught us, is that for multiple heirs to be costly, you need this effect combined with a high contribution of males to the resources. And let me illustrate this with this diagram here, where we have a man who is transferring resources to his wife's offspring, and of course there may be some depletion in the value of resources because the resources are divided. And if you take the other extreme, where you have high female contribution, where essentially the wives are contributing, in this case, all of the resources inherited by their offspring, then there is no depletion in the value of resources contributed by the male. And so intuitively, one way to think about this is that the best strategy for a male is to marry as many wives as possible, and then the wives contribute all of the resources inherited by their own offspring. So, okay, at the final condition driving the stability of monogamous marriage is that females allocate paternity strategically. So if females allocate paternity strategically, then polygynous males will have lower relatedness compared to monogamous males. And you can think of this in terms of a social cost to being polygynous. So in inclusive fitness terms, you want multiple wives because multiple wives produce multiple children. But of course, if only a small fraction of those children are your children because paternity is low, then the potential benefit of polygyny is eroded. So I illustrate this here, where you have a monogamous setting with high paternity. The male is happy because all of the wives' offspring are his own offspring. But if you have a man who has multiple wives and multiple offspring, but the wives have extra pair mates, for example, then the potential benefit of this multiple offspring to the male is reduced. And so, as I said, you can think of this in terms of the social cost to polygynous marriage if females respond strategically to different marriage strategies. So these are the results of the model. Let me tell you briefly how this fits with what we know about the distribution of marriage strategies across human societies first, and then I'll turn to a couple of case studies testing some of the predictions. So we know that monogamous marriage is prevalent in societies of Europe and Asia, at least historically. These are societies that have practiced intensive modes of production, so for example, plough or irrigation agriculture. And anthropologists like Jack Goody, but also economists like Esther Botterup have argued that these are societies where the value of resources is depleted through division among multiple heirs. The idea being that where you have high productivity, you also have scarcity of land. And so when there is no further land, dividing your estate at each generation among 2 or more offspring is not a very clever idea, because very quickly you get to a point where the estate is too small to be viable. Polygyny, on the other hand, is prevalent has been prevalent historically in the societies of sub-Saharan Africa. These are societies that traditionally have practiced extensive modes of production, where the value of resources is not depleted through division among multiple heirs. Extensive modes of production include horticulture, so hoe agriculture, for example, and pastoralism. Now, in horticulture, the typical scenario is that land is available. At marriage, a man will clear a plot of land for a wife who then works the land. The sort of the key fact here is that it's not so much how much land you own that determines how productive you are, but it's how much labor you have available to work on the land. It's labor that is the limiting factor in productivity, as opposed to ownership of the land. In pastoralism, things are slightly different. Of course, if you divide a herd between 2 sons, each starts off with a smaller herd, but livestock reproduce, and so you have a potential of going back to the original size of the herd. If you divide a plot of land between 2 sons, land is not going to reproduce quite in the same way. So this is mainly the work of Jack Goody and others who have talked extensively about these things. Now, an interesting fact for our purposes is that if you do a cross-cultural analysis, but also if you look at anecdotal evidence for different societies, you find that availability of land for expansion is a key ecological determinant of polygynous marriage. And this suggests that as land becomes scarce, polygynous marriage becomes problematic. And this may make monogamous marriage more likely. And then finally, and to me this is the more interesting of all these facts, is the idea that, again, if you do a cross-cultural analysis, you will find that polygynous societies with polygynous marriage, tend to have higher female contribution to subsistence compared to monogamous societies. And this is a fact that is very well known in the anthropological literature, but for which we don't have a very good explanation. People have come up with some very fanciful explanation. My favorite one is that where you have intensive modes of production, these are societies that tend to have monogamous marriage. Intensive modes of production tend to lead to higher fertility, and so women are pregnant a lot of the time, and so they won't contribute to. So there have been a lot of sort of attempts at explaining this, but in fact, within our framework, this can be explained very simply. That in the sense that if a female is contributing a good chunk of the resources that go to her own offspring, then it's the best strategy for a man is to marry as many wives as possible. That's the idea. So we can explain this particular observation very relatively neatly within our framework. So these are sort of general patterns that we know from the anthropological literature, but the model also makes some more specific prediction to some degree that we can test against the archaeological, historical, and ethnographic data. So in the archaeological record, we would expect to find monogamous marriage and the emergence of monogamous marriage with the development of norms, development of intensive agriculture, possibly coupled with norms that resulted in higher paternity. In high paternity, so for example, ideologies of sexual fidelity, ideology of premarital virginity, and so forth. We should also expect to see a sort of relatively early origin for monogamous marriage, and I say here early in quotes, to contrast it with a lot of explanations in the social sciences, in anthropology and sociology and demography, that link monogamous marriage to features of modern societies. So for example, democracy, industrialization, Christianization, and so forth. If we link monogamy to subsistence factors and other social factors, then we can actually push back the origin of monogamous marriage quite a bit. In the historical record, we would expect to see transitions between marriage strategies to be linked to shifts in availability of land. And finally, in the ethnographic record, we would expect to see an association between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer. Now, I don't have data to test all of these, but I'll show you sort of case studies that go some way into addressing a couple of these. And the first one is this idea of an early origin for monogamous marriage compared to a very late origin linked to democracy, industrialization, and so forth. So I use cross-cultural data to do this. So these are the same data that I've shown you plotted on a map at the very beginning of the talk. And I use a set of techniques from phylogenetic methods that allow us to do ancestral state reconstructions. So the way this works very briefly is that we take our cross-cultural data and then we take a proxy for population history in the form of phylogenetic tree. So the phylogenetic tree will tell you which societies at the tips of the tree are more closely related to one another than they are to other societies. So we're all familiar with trees, but so this represents the ancestral of all the societies at the tips. And this represents time, so we go through the route towards the tips of the tree. And the reason we incorporate this proxy for population histories is that we want to control for potential distortions in the data that come from the fact that societies are related by way of descent from a common ancestor. So we take these data, put them together. So what I've done here is I've mapped the cross-cultural data onto the tree, and then we use some statistical techniques to reconstruct back the history of these practices. So I've used this technique on a particular language family, which is the Indo-European language family. If you believe, there is a lot of controversy about the origin of Indo-European languages. If you believe recent studies, then these place the origin in present-day Turkey, in Anatolia, some I guess 7 to 9,000 years ago. And so the story goes that these language families spread from Anatolia into the Indian subcontinent and all the way up to Northern Europe, in fact, all the way to Iceland, which is not Iceland, unfortunately. The reason I focused on this particular language family is that in terms of kinship and family organization, it's relatively weird compared to other language families. So, for example, we find high frequencies of monogamous marriage compared to other parts of the world. We find high frequencies of neolocal residence, where a couple moves away from the wives and husband's kin, and so forth. So relatively strange in terms of family organization. Okay, so this is a tree capturing the sort of population history of the different Indo-European-speaking societies that I've been looking at. This is in fact what we call a consensus tree. It's a tree summarizing a sample of 750 trees in this case. The reason we want a sample of trees, so a distribution of trees, this is a Bayesian posterior distribution of trees, is that it allows us to incorporate into our estimates the uncertainty that is associated with building trees, especially in this particular case. These are trees built from linguistic data. So what you do see here are the groups that you would expect to see in a Indo-European family tree, language tree. So these are the Indo-Iranian languages. These are the Balto-Slavic languages, and these are the Europeans, so the Romance languages and the sort of Celtic, Germanic languages down here. And then a few languages that we never know where to put. And so let me just explain very quickly. So for example, in this particular branch here, we have a 56. So this means that 56% of trees in our sample group together Greek and Armenian as sister taxa. Yeah. In this particular case, this node down here is reconstructed quite important. Yeah. So we do the statistical analysis on the full sample. I'm just showing you here a summary to illustrate how this works. Okay. The root here of the tree, this is Proto-Indo-Hittite. It's a sort of ancestor of all of these languages. Proto-Indo-European is the ancestor of the Indo-European languages. There is a group of extinct languages that we also included in the Proto-Indo-Hittite language family. Okay, so what I've done here is I've mapped the marriage strategies on the tree for the cross-cultural data. Blue is polygamous marriage, pink is monogamous marriage. Then I've used some Bayesian phylogenetic techniques to reconstruct the ancestral states of the practices onto the tree. And what we do see from the reconstruction is that at the root of the tree, we reconstruct monogamous marriage with relatively high posterior probabilities. Posterior probability in this particular case, it's incorporating uncertainty in reconstruction of the node. So we reconstruct monogamy for the very root, Proto-Indo-Hittite down here, but also for Proto-Indo-European with relatively high confidence. So that is one approach. Here's another approach that we can use to reconstruct past.
Could we go back
Sure.
one slide? So this doesn't include any African societies.
No, this is only the
Only
European
the
speakers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be very interesting to look at the African case. The only tree that we have is for Bantu, and there is no monogamy. So very hard to do that. So I'm going back, let's say 9,000 years. If we could do a big trees of all human societies, we could go back to the very yeah. Okay, see, this is a different approach to reconstruct, very different approach to reconstructing past social organization. This is a study published a few years back now, is looking at this particular community in Germany, community of Euler. This is a community that is associated with the Portuguese culture, an archaeological tradition that is thought to be associated with Indo-European speaking societies. Now, this particular study looked at burial patterns at this site, and what they did find was one burial where you have a man, a woman, and two children buried in the same grave. And the children, through analysis of ancient DNA, they established that the children are genetically related to the man and the woman. And so they conclude that this is the earliest evidence of a nuclear family in human history. Now, this is a very neat study, obviously, but we only have one grave, and it was one in this particular case. And more importantly to me is that this really tells us something about the burial patterns. It doesn't tell us anything about family organization, right? There could be other wives that are buried somewhere else, but it was very glamorous back then. This paper came out. But so I guess I'm showing you these very different approaches to give you a sense of ways that we can get to the sort of past of human social systems. So this was looking at this particular inference that we draw from our model. We now go to the next one, which is this idea that we should see an association between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer of resources across generation. So again, I've used cross-cultural data to do this, the same data that I've shown you, in fact, mapped on the map earlier on. I've used hierarchical linear analysis in this particular case, and I've used a subset of the standard cross-cultural sample of 87 societies, and these are societies for which I have data on 4 variables. So I looked at marriage strategy, whether the society was monogamous or polygynous, inheritance strategy for land, whether there is vertical transfer, so transfer to wives, offspring, for land and for movables separately. Movable property are things like livestock and money and other property that's not land, essentially. And I also put in data for religious affiliation, and so whether a society is Christianized or not. And the reason I've done this is that there are some, in fact, there is work by, again, Jack Goody, that claims that if we do see an association between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer, it's because the societies in which we see this association were Christianized. And the idea is that the church was trying to limit the number of legal heirs. And one way to do this was to enforce monogamy on the one hand and to enforce or to restrict the pathways of transferring resources on the other. And so this is why we should see this association. Historians told me that they don't really believe this work. Really was an anthropology, not a historian. But he does have a very influential book on the topic. So I can't tell because I don't know the historical data as well as the historians, but it's a hypothesis that is worth testing. So I've used, as I said, hierarchical linear analysis, and what I'm showing you here are the significant interactions that are included in the model that comes out of the analysis. These are all two-way interactions, and we have an interaction between inheritance of land and inheritance of movable property. The way to read these plots is horizontally. So what this particular plot is telling you, for example, is that societies that have a norm for vertical transfer of movable property also have a norm for vertical transfer of land. So 74% of societies with vertical transfer in one type of property also have vertical transfer in a different type of property. So this is simply saying that, I guess, as you expect, there's congruence between inheritance strategies for different types of property. Now, this particular plot here is telling you that there is an interaction between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer of land. So 90% of societies with monogamous marriage also have vertical transfer of land, and only 55% of polygynous societies have vertical transfer of land. Now, this is what we were expecting to, or hoping to find. And this result to me is all the more interesting because although we have this congruence of transfer strategies for different types of property, we do not see an association between marriage strategy and transfer strategy for movable property. So it's kind of suggesting that societies with monogamous marriage are really emphasizing vertical transfer of land, not vertical transfer of any type of property. This is quite interesting to me. And finally, we do see an association between monogamous marriage and religious affiliation, so a much larger proportion of societies that have monogamous marriage are also Christianized compared to polygynous societies. And what is so this is kind of what you'd expect, but what is interesting is that we don't see a three-way association between religion, transfer strategy, and marriage strategy. So the association that we do see between marriage strategy and religion does not explain away this particular association. So this to me is particularly interesting. I'm looking to redo this analysis with better quality data for religious affiliation, but I think the result is very interesting. So this is a test of the latter prediction. As I said, there has been some work, mostly by Goody again, trying to say that we should see this association between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer, but there really hasn't been much discussion of this in the anthropological literature, but it's a relatively clear pattern that we do see. So, going back, I've shown you tested these two predictions of the model. I wish I had data to test the others, but I think generally our theoretical framework does give us a sort of a framework to, for example, define things consistently, defining marriage strategies in a consistent way that we can aim to test with the historical data or the archaeological data. Okay, I have three take-home messages for you, and one is that we see a lot of variation in human family systems, although we tend to think that the natural form of the human family is a sort of nuclear monogamous family. This is not quite true. I've told you and hopefully convinced you that we can make some progress by thinking of marriage strategies as inheritance strategies. So thinking, for example, of monogamous marriage as a form of monogamous inheritance. And that thinking in this way can help us explain some of the patterns that we see in the cross-cultural distribution of marriage strategies. And I guess my sort of broader point is that sort of way of thinking about questions in anthropology and the social sciences more generally from within an evolutionary framework does help us think of some of the questions in history in a very quantitative way, and we have some hope of getting to transform human history into a scientific endeavor.